Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Sidebar Social. I'm your co-host, Jennifer Grinke.
Love it when you say that. I'm the host, Dana Stewart. All right, Jen, let's talk about getting buzzed.
Okay.
No, I'm just kidding. We're going to talk about buzzwords today.
Buzzwords.
Buzzwords.
Okay. The other thing sounded more fun.
Yeah, it does sound more fun. But we'll talk about the words that come up a lot in family law.
Yes.
Off the top of your head, what is a buzzword you can think of?
Number one thing I hear is narcissist.
Everyone's a narcissist.
Everyone's a narcissist.
Yes. What else can you think of? Buzzword.
Everyone's being gaslit.
Yeah, those often go hand in hand. And then I think another one, parental alienation.
Yep.
Those
That
are
one
probably
this week.
top three. Out of this week?
Yeah. This week.
We have those or hear those all the time. So we've brought back a friend.
Yes,
and a
we're so
colleague.
excited.
Yes, Kathleen Schofield, welcome back.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes,
I'm glad to be back.
We love having you on.
Love it.
So
The chair's comfy.
we want you to be comfy.
This is her
you.
first time in the new studio.
That's right, it is.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
great. I love it, you guys.
You don't have
Looks
the
so
mic, like,
good.
slapping
I
you.
know. I like it. It looks great.
It's better this way. So buzzwords.
Yes.
Yeah.
You want to talk about the words that literally we hear every single day.
You hear them a lot too?
I mean, multiple times throughout the day. Yes.
Do you think so we mentioned narcissism,
Narcissist.
gaslighting,
Yep.
and parental alienation.
Yes.
Anything else that you hear a lot?
I mean, those are probably the top three, especially ones that I would say persist throughout either the separation, the divorce case, the custody case, and then whatever, kind of intervention that I'm participating in. So they have staying power. They have lasting power. They end up being, part of the individual's narrative or story, that sticks with it. So.
Yeah. So if somebody comes into your office and they're like, hey, I need to let you know, because I feel like it's always like, I need to let you know my husband is a narcissist. I mean, like, what's your next step with them?
So it's kind of the most famous opening line of like, I know you hear this all the time, but my ex is a narcissist. And it's not that I want to be dismissive of their experience and their feelings and whatever it is that they've been through. It's just the word is so commonly used and thrown around, and there's a pop psychology term, to it, that it ends up not being really helpful information for me because I'm not in a role where I'm going to be diagnosing. So when I hear that, it's kind of like, oh, okay, all right, well, we've really got to dive into what are the core issues, what are the behaviors that you're seeing. So it ends up not being very, very helpful. Because I don't know what that word means to that person. Does it mean the same thing that it means to me clinically? And what are they drawing from as far as how they're making that definition and diagnosis?
So it's more about the actions or behaviors, less about the label.
Right.
From your point of view.
And in reality, it's not a narcissist, it's narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. So that is a pattern of behavior. You have to meet a specific number of criteria. So I'm pretty sure there's 9, and you've got to meet 5 over, several months' time. And that diagnosis really needs to come from an evaluator, from a psychologist, from a medical doctor. In the roles that I play, I'm not going to be diagnosing someone.
So it's supposed to come from an evaluator, but we
or
feel
a
like
psychologist.
many people get the diagnosis from ChatGPT. seeing
ChatGPT, social media, TikTok. One of the hardest parts about this type of dynamic, this type of personality is there's so much out there, and typically it's very black and white. It's a short snippet. You're looking at like a 60-second TikTok or a minute and a half reel where somebody's going, oh, if your co-parent does this, if your ex does this, they're a narcissist. Well, in reality, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And I think we also have to acknowledge that there are oftentimes features of personality disorders, that a person is exhibiting when they're going through kind of the hardest time of their life. So if it was something that was in the marriage, most definitely it's going to be pronounced in the separation, the divorce, and kind of post-divorce process. And that's where I like to hear about features. What are the features that we're seeing? Because I also have to take into account the fact that these people are going through the toughest time in their life. It's the most fear-inducing. It's scary. Everything is changing. And of course, everything is going to be so heightened in this time of like stress and tension. So.
Okay, Kathleen, you talked about NPD has to be diagnosed by somebody who has the qualifications to do that. Do you find that that's getting diagnosed often in the people you're working with?
The data is a little conflicting as far as what percentage of the population does actually have MPD. The most readily available data says about 1%. That's probably a little low. What I do see on the rise are features of personality disorders, especially in high conflict family systems, divorce, separation, et cetera.
Yeah, so can you give an example of that? Like the features or kind of signs or traits?
So probably one of the biggest ones is that lack of accountability, lack of empathy, pretty inflated ego, wanting people to show up a certain type of way, only showing up if, there's something in it for me or I'm going to get something out of it,
If you have a person you're working with, a client that you're working with who believes their co-parent might have NPD or they've got those traits, what are some things that you give them tool-wise to help protect them in the case or help deal with that parent?
So kind of depends on what role I'm in. If I'm in an individual therapist role, I am going to support and validate and help them through the healing process, understand how they're participating in kind of a conflictual cycle of communication, but also helping them to accept that, like, even post-divorce, this person is probably going to still be pretty difficult. And so how can we figure out a way to be a little bit more gray rock in our responses, a bit more apathetic, less access to our emotions. If I read something, I just respond strategically. I keep it focused on the children. I'm not responding and doing a tit for tat. I'm not taking the bait. I'm really reading something going, I don't have to respond to that, or, that's not helpful. I'm just going to let that go. And then also helping them to understand what are the pieces of information that you do need to share with your co-parent, and how can you put that in a way that is brief and informative, a little friendly, but again, more strategic, so that we're not engaging in chaos and conflict post-divorce decree or post-modification, because we know from extensive research that really hurts the kids.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about another buzzword. Let's talk about gaslighting. I think that initially, and we'll talk about parental alienation, but I feel like that was the original term that got thrown around, and then it's morphed over time. But gaslighting is something that we seem to hear a lot now.
Yeah. What even is it? Can you tell us what it is?
So gaslighting is a pattern of behavior where the person is actually committing some type of offense or doing something, and when they're called out on it, they shift it back to the other person and kind of create this influence or this story that the other person is going crazy or going insane. So it really has to have that element of the person on the receiving end is questioning, their sanity. Like, am I losing it? Did this, really happen a different way? What is going on? Because it's very much a pattern over time. It actually came from a play, and it was in 1938, this play, and then it got made into a movie, I think in 1944. It was called Gaslight, and it's where the male protagonist was dimming slowly the gaslights in his house, because I believe he was trying to steal something from his wife. I think it might have been jewelry. And she kept saying, like, I feel like the lights are getting dimmer. And he's like, no, you're going crazy. You're insane. Nothing's changing. And that's where the term actually came from.
I always wondered where that came from.
Yeah, that's where it came from.
That's actually really good to know.
Next time we can watch the movie.
Okay. We'll get some popcorn.
And I think the problem that I have with gaslighting and the way that I see it used in my office across the board in all roles is it ends up more about a disagreement. If I turn around and say, hey, that didn't happen that way for me, it happened a little bit differently, just kind of like a basic disagreement, maybe a co-parenting disagreement, something from the past, because when people are emotional, they are going to experience communication and conversation differently. So someone coming out to say, hey, this happened differently for me, now the response is, oh, well, you're gaslighting me now. And that's a problem because we can't just have a normal, constructive conversation where we have disagreement. And that definitely is a fundamental issue in most co-parenting relationships.
Watering down the term almost by overusing it.
It definitely waters down, the term. And then it also doesn't give us a way to actually problem solve and to stay productive, to be focused on the actual issue at hand. And remember, in kind of my previous podcast, I talk about accusations, assumptions. When you start throwing around that accusation, well, now we're going to shift to talk about character again.
Right.
And we're always going to defend our character, right? Especially, when we're talking about our role as a parent. So.
Wow. And do you find that people that have traits, or maybe they do have NPD, or they have traits of it, does the gaslighting go hand in hand with that?
Oh, yes, definitely. Because remember, they don't have any accountability.
Right.
They don't take responsibility. It's everyone else's fault. There's, a lot of blame shifting. An individual with NPD actually is extremely insecure, and they do these things in order to kind of inflate, their ego and their sense of self.
And you mentioned when you were talking a moment ago about being brief, informative, somewhat friendly, and then the last part of that, the firm, right? That's the BIF model.
Yes.
Can you just briefly touch on that for our viewers? Because I think it's really helpful for them to know how to engage or how to respond.
So when I am starting a facilitation case, I lay out a lot of communication boundaries and guidelines. It's not enough to say, hey, don't do this. I now have to also tell you, hey, this is what I want you to do. So I like for individuals to craft communication that is almost kind of bullet points or items. Hey, we have this problem. Here is a proposal that I think would solve for this. Here's a potential solution, or maybe I don't know what it is that we should do about this. And then the individual, your co-parent responds, yes, I agree to that. No, I don't agree to that. I want more time to think about it, and I'm going to get back to you on an expected response date. When we start sending paragraphs, and it's almost kind of like we're relitigating, hey, this is what we should do, and this is why I think we should do it. The message kind of gets lost. It's kind of drowning in very lengthy and wordy and kind of lecturing in tone and content.
Right.
And then when people go, and this is what's in the best interest of the child, well, then the other person's going to go, well, I don't agree, but now I have to argue about the fact that, hey, I do still want what's in the best interest of the child. I just don't agree in this. So keeping everything proposal-based, solutions-focused, what's the issue at hand, and accepting no. Sometimes we just have to accept no instead of kind of coming back, well, you're such a, blank for not agreeing to this, or you're hurting your child, or, again, accusatory language like that. And go back and forth a couple of times. If you can't get it there, then pause and then bring it back to someone like me in a facilitator or coordinator role. Because sometimes I can get real creative and I can find a solution that you haven't thought of that gets everybody a little bit of what they want, but you don't get everything that you want, which is honestly the fundamentals of co-parenting. Hey, we have to share. We got to learn how to compromise. So
follow us and join the conversation on Instagram and YouTube at Sidebar Social.
All right, let's move over to the third term we've talked about.
Third buzz.
Parental alienation. I think that's the OG of the buzzwords.
It really is. It's been around for several years. It definitely has legs in the, pop psychology usage of the term, and there is so much misinformation online, so many rabbit holes that you can go down. So to me, it's a little bit more of a dangerous, use of it. Because it, kind of traps both parents in a very conflictual cycle that directly impacts the kids.
Well, let's unpack that. Well, actually, it's been around so long, it's not even called parental alienation anymore, right? Resist, refuse dynamics?
Yeah. Well, there really isn't a clinical term for this. This is something that, really was, kind of formulated within, the family law sector. We do have some really great psychologists that have written good books about it. We've got a local gentleman that has written quite a bit about it. But it's not a diagnosis. It's not a diagnosis that we're going to attach to a parent, to a child. We really need to look at it as it is a family system issue. It is, and where the child is exhibiting resist and refusal dynamics for no valid, reliable, or accurate reason. And in my experience, a better way to look at that is both parents are engaging in some alienating behaviors. That's the term that I like to use in my office. And that's the thing that we have to address. And a lot of times they're a bit more subtle. Especially the parent who has the intact relationship with the child, they are typically doing things that are a little bit more subtle that they don't even realize. But what happens, especially to the parent that has the strained relationship with the child, it becomes more about a term used to describe our co-parent and all these things that they're doing, shifting the blame away from them and onto the other parent. And then now we've got a real bad problem where these are two adults fighting, and a child is definitely caught in the middle of all of this.
We deal with a lot where whether we're the parent or whether we represent the estranged parent or the favored parent, preferred parent, however, I don't know what the correct phrasing is, but it always seems like each person, each parent, 100% blames the other. And you're kind of touching on that, where there's zero willingness to kind of acknowledge maybe I had a hand in this. Do you see a lot of that as well, where it's pretty polar as far as who's to blame?
It's very polarized, and they're very entrenched in their narrative, their story, their version of events. And that's the problem, is trying to get them to move and see it with more context, with more nuance, less black and white, because at the end of the day, the way to repair the relationship is for everybody to come together, acknowledge, make amends, apologize, talk about what they need to do differently in order for the child to feel like, hey, I'm not in a loyalty bind anymore. I can have a relationship with both of my parents, and they are moving on and I can move on too. It's really, really hard to repair a parent-child relationship when the parent-parent relationship is in such turmoil.
What are some, I know you said it can be subtle what they're doing. What is an example of something that would be subtle that would amount to what you're talking about?
So when you have the preferred parent or the parent that has the intact relationship, sometimes they will listen to the child, and what the child is expressing or experiencing with their co-parent feels very much like what they experienced in the marriage. And so they'll kind of over-identify a little bit with those emotions, and they might say something along the lines of, yeah, your dad used to do that to me, or your mom used to say that to me all the time, or I remember exactly how that feels. And now we're having almost kind of like an adult conversation about adult emotions with a child, when the relationships that we're referring to are totally different. A husband and wife is very different from a parent-child.
Yeah.
So you have to really sit there and go, wait a second, I know that I felt this way, but I need to support my child and validate them for sure, but then say, hey, I hope that you can maybe talk to your therapist about this, or hopefully you can talk to your other parent at some point about this. So it's these subtle things of, oh yeah, your dad used to do that, your mom used to say that. On the flip side, if you're the parent with the strained relationship, one of the ones that I hear a lot is they'll get really mad and they'll go, just go over to the other parent's house. I don't ever want to see you again. They don't actually mean that,
Right.
but it's something that they say that the child, it really, really sticks with the child. Or they'll go, you know what, you sound just like your mom. You sound just like your dad. That's what they used to say to me too. And they'll assign the child's experience and voice and emotions, to the other parent. And then the child gets really frustrated, like, why aren't you hearing me? These are my feelings. Like, I have my own independent thought. Why are you not hearing me? And then they get really frustrated to the point where then they stop talking. Those are really subtle examples that I have to give parents different ways to, well, first off, they got to acknowledge it to the child and say, hey, I shouldn't have said that. That was wrong. And this is what I'm going to do in the future to ensure that we don't have this in our relationship, or you don't feel that way.
And do you have a preference on, if there is a family that has this dynamic, the resist refuse? I feel like, and tell me what you think, Jen, like we used to always think, oh, we need reunification therapy because there's this one parent that has the problem with the child. But the longer that I feel like we've practiced and seen real world examples, it is more of a family issue. Family therapy almost seems more appropriate a lot of times than what we in the legal field think of as reunification. How do you feel about that?
I prefer family counseling over reunification, but if you talk to other reunification therapists, they'll say, yes, I always bring in and involve, the parent that has the intact, the intact relationship. So we really, even if we're doing reunification or family, we have to involve that other parent. It's important. I also think that we need to really clarify and say reunification is not appropriate if there has been abuse. And I think if you're trying to put a child in front of a parent who has actually, committed abusive behavior, that's contraindicated, So when I talk through these issues or these dynamics, they're relational in nature. They are not, they're not rising to the level of abuse, neglect, or harm. So
what if there's a situation where a parent has abused a child, but maybe wasn't convicted of abuse? Could have been excessive discipline, something like that. And now they're in this process of family therapy, reunification therapy, and that parent refuses to own up to what they've done.
So we're going to hit an impasse. You can't repair a relationship if a child says this happened and the other parent said it absolutely did not. We're at an impasse. It's going to stall out. It's not going to be able to move forward because the child needs to hear that insight and awareness, ownership and accountability, and then also, hey, this is what I'm going to do differently. This is how I'm going to change my behavior, moving forward. So that happens pretty often. Or they'll say like, well, I only did this because your mother, your father did this. So we're back in that justification cycle. Right. And I just say to the parent, look, do you want to be right or do you want a relationship with your kiddo? Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, usually a lot of things have happened, and the repair still needs to be, hey, owning, taking responsibility and saying what it is that we're going to, do moving forward.
So that parent, the estranged parent, has to meet the child where they are emotionally, yes. whether that parent agrees with their view Correct. Of what happened.
And I think also understanding that when you're emotional, especially as a child, you may not necessarily view things in the same way that, the parent views it. And I kind of say, look, you have to honor how your kid experienced that because they were younger, they were afraid, they were little. And also, if they see conflict and fighting between both of their parents, even if it's happening around them, it still shapes the lens that they see you through. And a lot of parents, they go, well, I never really touched the child. But yes, we did have a lot of fights, a lot of yelling, a lot of screaming. And I'm like, well, guess what? That's going to shape how they see you and how they hear you, even if you don't feel that you're yelling. And sometimes what I'll do in my office is I'll help the child by saying, hey, define what this means for you. Like if, the child goes, well, you yell all the time. And the other parent's like, no, I don't. I'm just intense. I go, okay, define for your parent what yelling means so they can understand. And then I say to the parent, okay, start adjusting, adjusting what it is, how you're speaking. Because we need to speak to the way a person receives it, not necessarily how we think, they should be talked to.
To learn more about Greinke Stewart Family Law, visit GreinkeStewartLaw.com.
On the flip side of the estranged parent, the favored parent, we had a case years ago where my client was the favored parent and the child didn't want to go see the other parent. And for a while, I thought it was that other parent's fault. But then with your help, we started to understand that my client was even unintentionally doing certain actions that were kind of causing strain in that relationship. I'm just curious for you, do you see that quite often where the parent who is favored is maybe oblivious to what they're doing that could cause that harm?
Oh, yes, because they think they're doing right by their child. I'm honoring the way that they feel. I'm honoring their voice. Like, I'm not going to make them go over there. I'm not going to make them do, X, Y, and Z. And oftentimes they really genuinely don't realize. They think they're just protecting their child. Yeah. And they're also internally activated themselves. This is scary for them as well. And on the flip side of that, the other parent, the one with the strained relationship, almost always thinks that that preferred parent, that favored parent, is doing this intentionally and maliciously. Right. So you can see where the communication breaks down and becomes very accusatory and conflictual in nature, and there isn't a way out, right? How do we get on the other side of this? And the kid's going to remain in that polarized place as long as the parents continue to, to fight and to have those issues.
So how do you fix it?
You get a really good family therapist. Get everybody in the room, try and, repair the relationship. I like to meet with parents and the child individually a couple of times because I want to ready them. I want to earn their trust, build rapport, give them education. So that when I am finally, doing some conjoint sessions, I have a good idea of like where they're going to go, and I think I know how everybody's going to show up.
And what do you find to be, I don't know, is there a percentage of cases where you've seen positive resolution?
It really depends on, the personalities and if they want to do the work and if they want to be humble and if they want to change and just kind of own. Lately it's been a little bit higher percentage, but reunification, any sort of alienating, behavior or accusations as such, are usually really low in success rate, especially since it's hard on the child. And the parent that has the strained relationship wants it fixed right now, wants everything to happen right now. So they're on really, really different timelines. In reality, repair and rebuilding of trust, it's slow. It's very slow. Slow change is lasting change.
And if that person does have traits of NPD, it's going to be hard to take accountability, right?
Yeah, well, they don't. I mean, that's the thing is, when you're coming and sitting in front of me and you're saying like, hey, my ex is a narcissist or my co-parent is a narcissist, I need more information, to understand what that means, because I am I'm not assessing for NPD. I'm assessing for like, are these individuals ready to sit down and do work? Can they take accountability? Can they take responsibility? Are they capable of change? There is times where, hey, these interventions actually make it worse, make it more conflictual.
Oh, we've seen that.
Yeah, and it's like, hey, nobody's ready here. We need to break. We need to go get some individual therapy and then come back down and let's sit and see if we can, it's kind of similar to when people say, I've done marriage counseling, it didn't work. It's like, yeah, because you probably both weren't ready individually to sit down and do marriage counseling. Probably needed to do some individual therapy and then come back to, we call it the conjoint space. So.
Okay, Kathleen. So bottom line, this was a lot of great information. We learned a lot of buzzwords today that we're not going to use anymore, right? So if somebody's starting the divorce process or just any family law situation, is your advice, leave those buzzwords at the door, engage in the process, tell the therapist the features, and let the therapist help you as a therapist knows how?
It is best if you bring examples, documentation, communication, show me what it is that you're talking about, describe the behavior, describe the core issues, gives me a wonderful jumping off point and a launch pad for where I need to go in the process.
So we'll leave the labels at home.
It would be helpful. Unless we have a diagnosis, it would be helpful.
Caveat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming on again.
Thanks for having me
Thank
again. I
you
so
so
appreciate
much.
it. I love the new space.
Well, we love having you here. You always drop knowledge, so we appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that's it. That's a wrap. We'll see you next time on Sidebar Social.
Bye.